Hello, and welcome to this module examining naturalistic psychedelic use in Canada. My name is Philippe Lucas, and I'm a PhD cannabis and psychedelic researcher. I didn't start out as an academic researcher. That really wasn't my initial career choice. But in 1995, while I was studying to be a high school teacher at the University of Victoria, I was diagnosed with hepatitis C, which at the time was called non-Hep A, non-Hep B hepatitis. And since there was no cure at the time, I actually started using cannabis in order to treat the symptoms of the condition and also to stop the use of alcohol and tobacco that was harming my liver. Despite being a 25-year-old university student, I was having trouble finding a safe, consistent supply. So in 1999, I opened up the Vancouver Island Compassion Society, one of Canada's first medical cannabis nonprofit dispensaries. And I ran that organization for about 10 years, providing medical cannabis to patients in need while the federal Canadian government wrapped its head around how to do so more safely and effectively. Um, During my time at the VIX, I got interested in psychedelics as well. I'd gone through some trauma in my mid-20s. My father had died suddenly in alcohol-related circumstances. And of course, I was dealing with a disease or a condition, hepatitis C, that had no cure and that was giving me a lot of stress and anxiety. And I found that psychedelics were useful in dealing with some of the trauma of the sudden loss of my father, but also in helping me actualize myself and move forward with my life despite some of the challenges that I've been facing. Over the years, I've had a lot of experiences with cannabis and psychedelic. In the early 2000s, Rick Doblin reached out to ask if I would help co-found MAPS Canada, and I was happy to do so and served as the MAPS Canada board chair for its first 5 or so years of existence. Shortly after that, I began a study of ayahuasca as a treatment for trauma and addiction that followed Gabor Mate's work and his use of ayahuasca to deal with trauma and addiction. And that study led to a number of publications with my co-researchers, Gerald Thomas, Riel Kapler, Lena Argento, and Ken Tupper. I then founded the Victoria Association of Psychedelic Studies, along with a few other students that were at the University of Victoria. And in 2014, I was hired by Tilray, then a small cannabis startup that, of course, turned out to be the biggest cannabis company in the world. And I served 7.5 years at Tilray as VP Global Patient Research and Access, where I oversaw an extensive and comprehensive clinical research program in Canada, the US, and Australia, and also had the opportunity to conduct some of the largest observational studies of medical cannabis that had been done to that time. I left Tilray about just coming up on 2 years ago, so at the end of 2022 or 2021, and joined Savvy Mind after looking around at what the opportunities were around psychedelics. My modus operandi for the last 30 years has been trying to find ways to open up safe legal access to cannabis and now psychedelics. And I wanted to take some of the experience that I had working on medical cannabis and opening up access through reduction of stigma, changing of regulations to open up access, but also finding ways to increase cost coverage for medical cannabis patients. I wanted to take that experience and translate that and bring that over to the psychedelic industry as well, to ensure that all those who could benefit from psychedelic assisted psychotherapy didn't find obstacles to access, such as cost and otherwise. So Savvy Mind is a psychedelic clinic crew based in Calgary, Alberta. And our Calgary clinic opened up in March 2022. and has now been serving patients for over a year's time. And our Edmonton and Victoria clinics will be opening up in the next 6 or 8 weeks. So in Q2 of 2023. At Savvy Mind, I'm part of the leadership team, but I also help coordinate a lot of our research and data gathering, and that includes in 2022 launching the Canadian Psychedelic Survey, which is the largest survey of Canadian adult psychedelic use that's ever been conducted. And this year, in fact, within the next few weeks, in May 2023, we'll be launching the Global Psychedelic Survey, which is going to be the largest English language survey of adult psychedelic use to ever be conducted around the world. Today, I'm going to be sharing the results, the kind of high-level preliminary data from the Canadian Psychedelic Survey. So you might be asking yourself, why is it important for me to know about non-therapeutic psychedelic use as well as therapeutic psychedelic use? Because the survey covers both. And there's a couple of reasons why I think this is really important. First of all, at least for the foreseeable future, the majority of patients who are going to be seeking psychedelic-assisted treatments will have had previous experiences with psychedelics outside of a clinical setting. So I think it's really important for therapists and practitioners who know and understand the rates of psychedelic use in Canada, how Canadians are using psychedelics, and the self-reported impacts that's happening, that psychedelics are having on their health and well-being. Additionally, I really think that almost everything that we know about medical cannabis came because patients who were using cannabis in non-clinical settings without doctors' prescriptions started to share their outcomes with individuals when they found that they were having good therapeutic outcomes. And with psychedelics, it's very much the same thing. And so almost everything that we know about the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, such as impacts on trauma, depression, anxiety, and even chronic pain, did not come about because we ran clinical trials and made these surprising discoveries. We know about these because end users who are using them in non-clinical settings found these therapeutic outcomes and wanted to share them with others. Now science is trying to catch up by doing phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials in order to confirm what psychedelic end users have been sharing with us all around. So I find it incredibly important for us to listen to the voice of end users. And I find that most of the work that I do as a researcher is really translating the voice of end users into data that can open up access to cannabis and to psychedelics, or to these more stigmatized or marginalized therapeutic options. So without any further ado, I'd like to share with you now the preliminary results of the Canadian Psychedelic Survey. So I want to start out by positioning myself and sharing my theoretical background, which is that this is a study, and a lot of my research is an observational study. So it's a non-clinical study examining, and it's informed by the principles of community-based research, harm reduction, cognitive liberty, and personal rights and freedom. That's really where I situate myself when it comes to the right of both patients as well as non-patient or let's say non-medical uses of psychedelics. That's the way that I view the right of individuals to use psychedelics. Really comes from a lens of cognitive liberty and personal rights and freedoms. My goal as a researcher, as I alluded to, is to translate end user experiences by recording real-world evidence on their use, or ecological evidence on the use of psychedelics, and then data that informs policies and can improve safe legal access. And the guiding principles that I follow are can be spelled out by the saying "nothing about us without us," which is the recognizing the principle that if policies and laws are going to be made about psychedelics, those that use psychedelics should be involved in forming those laws since they're going to impact them. And so I feel that consumers and practitioners in the psychedelic space are the experts and should be involved in policy decisions impacting them. As an overview of today's presentation, I'll start out with an intro to the Canadian Psychedelic Survey. We'll look at background, goals, and methods, participant characteristics, substance and psychedelic use, access to psychedelics, the intent of use of psychedelics, peak experiences, patterns of co-use with other substances, therapeutic uses, and then we'll examine some qualitative feedback and findings from the survey, and finally close with a summary of findings and next steps for the Canadian Psychedelic Survey. So just a bit more about Savvy Mind. The reason that Savvy Mind is at the forefront of this research is that we are really invested in the idea of real-world evidence, and we see the value of real-world evidence. And overall, we've done not only the Canadian Psychedelic Survey, but we also do a detailed tracking of patient outcomes through a style of treatment called measurement-based care, which essentially has different steps in assessing the progress of patients who go through our psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy programs. And but we also believe in standard or more traditional clinical trials and the value of those. And our Calgary clinic is currently involved in a phase 2 trial of psilocybin and alcohol use disorder, sponsored by Clairvoyant. So the Canadian Psychedelic Survey is a comprehensive general population survey of psychedelic use in Canadian adults. The goal of CPS was to gather real-world evidence on the recreational and therapeutic use of psychedelics in Canada. It was a 650 question survey that gathered data from Canadians 19 age and over on patterns of use for 11 common psychedelics, including self-reported impacts on physical and mental health. The survey includes a number of novel and validated measures, including the AWE Experience Scale, developed by Johns Hopkins and David Yaden at Johns Hopkins, the GAD-7 assess anxiety, the PHQ-8 to look at depression, and the Wisconsin Smoking Withdrawal Scale. CPS was co-sponsored by the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies Public Benefits Corporation, SciGen, and Savvy Mind, and it was ethics approved by Advera and distributed online via NGOs for a 2-week period in 2022. I've got a number of academic collaborators in this study, Peter Hendricks at the University of Alabama, David Yaden at Johns Hopkins, Kevin Benke at the University of Michigan, Eric Barron at Cleveland Clinic, Stephanie Lake and Ziva Cooper at UCLA, Beth Patterson and Michael Van Ameringen at McMaster, Kyle Greenway at McGill, and Sarah Daniels at the University of British Columbia. The online survey took place between January 14th and 28th of 2022. We just did 2 weeks of data gathering online, and we received 2,384 responses from across Canada. The data was analyzed by Broad Street, and which is a third-party CRO, and this presentation highlights the primary results of CPS. The average age of respondents for CPS was 38 years old. We had an overrepresentation of women, with 56% of respondents being women, 38% being men, and 4% being non-binary. In terms of relationships, over 60% were in a committed relationship, and the majority were well-educated, with over 80% having a university degree, a college degree, or a technical degree. In terms of employment, nearly 80% reported working full or part-time. So I think overall you're seeing a fairly successful group of participants in the study compared to the Canadian average. In terms of racial identity, white respondents are significantly overrepresented at 87%. With an underrepresentation of all other groups except First Nation and Métis, which made up 6%, which is just a tiny bit higher than the general population of First Nation and Métis in the Canadian population. I'm very interested in other substance use as well. And so we asked participants whether or not they'd had previous lifetime experience with alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, crack, methamphetamines, prescription opioids or non-prescription opioids, as well as tobacco, nicotine, and also if they've used in the past year. And what we saw was that this was actually a fairly high substance using population. On the right hand of this table, you'll see the Canadian average, and you'll see when it comes to alcohol use, this particular population was slightly higher in terms of past year use. In terms of cannabis use, they were far higher than the Canadian average, which is a little bit different of a population, by the way. It's all Canadians age over 50, and so of course with CPS it was 19 and over. In terms of crack cocaine, or cocaine or crack, we saw a higher rate than average. Same with methamphetamine, prescription opioids, non-prescription opioids, and even tobacco and nicotine, where we saw at least 1/3 being exposed to nicotine or tobacco in the last year. I do want to mention that these patterns of use were impacted by COVID. We know that from specific questions around COVID in our questionnaire. So we actually don't know if this is going to carry over past COVID, these high rates of substance use. But we do know that other studies have found increases in substance use during COVID. And so that may also, by the way, affect the Canadian average over the 2 years of COVID compared to the data we had there from 2019. In terms of the age of first use of psychedelics, the median age was 19 and the mean age was 21.8. And just to give you a comparator, most Canadians who are going to try cannabis in their lifetime will try it between the ages of 15 and 16. So we could definitely see that sequentially, psychedelics happen 3 to 5 or 6 years later than initial cannabis initiation with most individuals. 74.9% of individuals report past year use, and 67% use less than once per month. So even though we had a high rate of past year use, most individuals do not use psychedelics very often. You can see that on this chart here looking at frequency. We did see that the most used substances were psilocybin with the median of 10 uses in terms of over a lifetime. But we also see that frequent users really skew the mean of lifetime use. So the average, the mean was 46, but the median was 10. And you see the same thing with MDMA and MDA, as well as ketamine. And just because this is the first time we're seeing this data, these are the 11 psychedelics that we asked some detailed usage questions about: 2CB, ayahuasca, DMT, and 5-MeO DMT, ibogaine and iboga, ketamine, LSD, MDMA and MDA, mescaline, nitrous, psilocybin, and salvia divinorum. So we asked about both microdosing and macrodosing. What we saw is that approximately 56% of respondents report microdosing at some point or another, and 73.5% report past year microdosing. So this is certainly a very popular approach to using psychedelics, and as we all know, if we're familiar with the media these days. But it's interesting to note that only 11.7% only microdose. In other words, the majority of respondents in this study macrodose and microdose as well. So psilocybin, as you can see from this table, is by far the most frequently reported microdose, with 83% reporting past year microdose of those that reported past year microdosing, and 81% reporting ever microdosing psilocybin. That's followed by LSD and MDMA, where we saw high rates of use as well. In terms of macrodosing, which we defined as taking a dose that's high enough to create a trip or an altered state of consciousness, approximately 93% report macro or regular use of psychedelics, 63.8% of which report past year macro use. So high rates of use, once again, this is during COVID. People may have had more time on their hands or more reasons to be using these substances. Psilocybin is the most frequently reported macro or regular dose. By far, once again, 81% reporting past year use and 87% lifetime use of study respondents. And we also had an other category where individuals could report other substances. And in the order of the number of mentions that we got in the other category, we saw that participants in CPS also cited uses of 4-ACO-DMT, cannabis, 3-MMC, 4-HOMET, and PCP. We also saw uses or reported uses of Hawaiian baby wood rose seeds, Amanita muscaria, and GHB. So we might consider adding some of these on in future iterations of this study. I'm very interested in how people access psychedelics, both how they accessed in the past year, but also what their preferred modes of access were. If the regulations were to change or laws were to allow it, how would you like to access your psychedelics? So in this particular chart, we see in blue how people accessed in the past year, and in orange how they would like to access if the regulations were to change. And what we see is the most popular way to access in the past year was a friend or online vendors. Those are the primary points of past year access. But when you move to preferred modes of access, you see online continues to be very popular, but you see other legal means of access like retail stores, healthcare professionals, pharmacies, supervised treatment clinics rising to the fore. And it's notable that in terms of desirability, the least popular is black market or street dealers in terms of options. So psychedelic users would like to be able to access psychedelics from a safe, legal source where there would be some quality testing and also some labeling for potency so that they can have some reliability of their supply and be sure of what they're taking and how much they're taking when they go through their psychedelic experiences. In terms of the intent of use, a variety of reasons were cited as to why participants chose to use psychedelics. And of course, respondents could answer more than one when they answered this question. But the number one response was fun. And that was followed by spiritual exploration, improvements of mental well-being, and personal growth. These were the most common reasons cited why people use psychedelics in Canada. It's also notable that around 11% say they used to reduce prescription drug use and 10% to reduce the use of other substances. So other notable reasons why people are using psychedelics as well. And of course, it's important to note that some of this tracks well with current research being done on therapeutic applications for psychedelics. However, I want to point out that the intent of use is very substance specific. For example, if you look at recreational use, recreation was the most often reported motivation of use for 2CB, ketamine, LSD, MDMA, nitrous oxide, psilocybin, and salvia. So here you can see right here, salvia and recreational use being very high, general well-being and therapeutic use being very low. However, when you look at self-exploration or mind expansion, you see that the top reported motivations of use were the top reported motivations for use for ayahuasca, DMT, ibogaine, and mescaline use. And I know this is a busy slide, but more than anything else, I really want you to understand that there is no single intent of use, and that overall patterns of use differ considerably between substances. So if you get anything out of the presentation today and the data that I'm sharing, is that we can no longer say, we have to stop saying that psychedelics do something, or that microdosing does something, or macrodosing does something. What we see here is that the individual's relationship with psychedelics can be quite different, and the reasons for use of different psychedelics can differ significantly between psychedelics. I was very interested in set and setting and what causes peak experiences, both positive and what would be associated with negative peak experiences as well. So let's start out by looking at positive peak experiences. So when you look at the set, which is basically the physical setting that people used in, we also looked at the setting, which we used kind of a proxy where and kind of an extension of the set of where they were using and how they're using in terms of the setting. So the set is who they were using with, their kind of mental state at the time, and the setting is where they were using. So 82% report having an intense positive peak experience of respondents to the study. Out of a score of 0 to 100, with 100 being the best experience ever, participants scored this experience as a median of 85 and a mean of 83%. So very significant experiences. The three most used psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA, accounted for over 80% of respondents' most intense positive experiences. And despite uncommon use, ayahuasca accounted for 5% of intense positive experiences. Peak positive experiences typically took place with a companion using the same or similar substance at home or in a natural environment. Now, looking at negative experiences, about 52%, so just over half of respondents report having an intense negative peak experiences. In the past, we might have called those bad trips. We now use a term like challenging experiences because there's some understanding that, particularly if we're using psychedelics to deal with trauma, that it won't be necessarily a fun or pleasant experiences. It's going to be challenging, but that could be part of the healing path of patients and therapists using psychedelics in the course of care. So out of the score of 0 to 100, with 0 being the worst experience ever, participants scored their peak negative experiences as a median of 39 and a mean of 40. The three most used psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA, accounted for over 80% of respondents' most intense challenging experiences. And despite uncommon use, ayahuasca accounted for 4% of peak negative experiences. So you see a bit of a mirror with the peak positive experience slide that we just saw. Being at home, being with a friend taking psychedelics, or using with a licensed or unlicensed therapist, healthcare provider, or shaman, all reduce the odds of having a challenging experience. Now, I'm very interested on what makes up a negative experience or a challenging experience. So we asked individuals to identify what it was that made this experience so challenging. The most common types of challenges were mental sensory overload, social paranoia, and concerns about health outcomes. But 34% said that they thought they would never be the same, and 26.1% worried they might die. So these negative experiences actually pose an existential threat to many participants. We know from research that most psychedelics have a very high safety profile in terms of their physical impact on humans. But when you've got such a high rate of folks who think that they might never be the same when they're having a negative experience or worried that they might die, we don't want to dismiss those experiences. For people going through a negative, challenging experience or a bad trip, this can be a really, really scary, very challenging, very negative experience. So we need to give room and for that and to be able to discuss those outcomes as well. Now, a lot of people have found that with distance and the distance of time, that those negative experiences can have positive outcomes. So we asked that question specifically, did some good come out of your negative experience? And 55% agree that some good came out of the experience. And in fact, at least only 18% disagree that at least some good came out of the experience. And when asked what good came out of the experience, we saw that gaining insight into a challenging issue, overcoming fears, or resolving challenging situations or emotions stand out as the primary reasons that they felt some good came out of these challenging experiences. Now, I'll kind of My background training, really isn't in psychedelics. It's kind of on substance use and addiction. And so I'm really interested in looking at the way that people use psychedelics, co-use other drugs, both before, during, and after their use of psychedelics, and also the way that the use of psychedelics overall can impact the use of other symptoms. So in this first part, we're looking at the co-use of drugs 2 hours before a psychedelic experience, during the psychedelic experience, and 2 hours after the psychedelic experience. We see that 28% of respondents say they typically co-use other substances immediately before, during, or after they use psychedelics, with 2CB, MDMA, and nitrous oxide seeing the highest rates of co-use. And the reason this is important is that understanding the co-use of other substances that are used during psychedelic experiences may be important to develop the associated harm reduction and benefit maximization strategies. For example, we may understand that psilocybin is not particularly dangerous to use on its own, but when we find out that a lot of people are drinking alcohol while they're using psilocybin, a harm reduction strategy may be to warn people not to drink alcohol or to be sure not to put themselves in a position to drive home if they are using psilocybin with friends or in a social situation. Here I wanted to show that the patterns of co-use, once again, are very substance specific, just like the reasons for use of different psychedelics. So here on this slide, we're looking at 2CB and nitrous oxide, and we see that these patterns of co-use suggest significant recreational use because of the high rates of alcohol, cannabis, and other psychedelic use that's typically used before, after, or during, or after the use of 2CB or nitrous. But when we look at ibogaine or ayahuasca, we see very little co-use of other substances. And this is likely because these substances are often used in a therapeutic setting specifically to treat problematic substance use. But even moreover, they have these ritualistic patterns of use that typically include abstinence for days, if not weeks, before their uses, and days after the use as well, that include abstaining from not only alcohol, tobacco, and some foods, but also, in the case of ayahuasca, traditionally from sexual encounters, etc. So we see, once again, I'll just flick back so you can see the difference. This is co-use of 2CB and nitrous, and then you go to ibogaine and ayahuasca with practically no co-use recorded. And we did a regression analysis, and it confirms that the primary intent of use impacts the odds of co-use with other substances. So if you cited that your primary reasons of use for a substance were primarily for medical or therapeutic uses, you saw significantly reduced odds of co-use of other substances, down to 0.64 in terms of the odds ratio. And citing recreational use as a primary intent results in over twice the odds of co-use with an odds ratio of 2.08. Now let's go to substitution. So in this case, we asked all respondents whether they had lifetime use of alcohol, antidepressants, benzodiazepines, cannabis, cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, both non-prescription and prescription, and tobacco use. And then if they had cited that they had lifetime use, we asked if their patterns of use changed following their psychedelic use. And what we saw is that 52.8% self-report decreasing their use of substances as a result of psychedelic use. 43.7% say decreasing or ceasing alcohol use following initiation with psychedelics. 42.4% cite decreasing or ceasing cocaine use, and 42.5% cite decreasing or ceasing antidepressant use. In terms of increases in use, which are here in yellow, and blue, which would be initiating of use. In other words, if you haven't used the substance before psychedelics, but you started to use after you use psychedelics, we saw that methamphetamine saw the greatest rate of initiation, and that cannabis saw the most was the most commonly cited in terms of increases in use over here. But whether, when we're looking at both methamphetamine and the increases in use compared to the decreases or ceasing of use, you see that overall there's a much greater decrease in use than there is an initiation or increase in use. And for those that cited decreases in use of other substances, we said, how did psychedelics, or we asked, how did psychedelics help you reduce substance use? And the top responses were that it made respondents feel more connected with themselves and others, feeling less anxious or depressed, or feeling more connected with nature. Ultimately, psilocybin was the psychedelic most often cited as having an impact in reducing other substance use, followed by LSD and acid. And I just want to point out how important a concept this is for both addiction and psychedelic use. The modern construct of addiction no longer looks at specific substances and their addictive potential, like, opioids being more addictive than cannabis, being, more addictive than tobacco or nicotine or otherwise. I think that there's some truth to the biological aspects of addiction, but these days we look more at the setting that leads people to develop problematic substance use disorders. And what we find is that disconnection from those that they love are both causal to problematic substance use, but also can be a detriment to getting out of addiction as well. And so when we find out that psychedelics help people feel more connected with themselves, with others, and with nature, we can start to understand why psychedelics across all substances that have been studied so far, many of the substances that have been studied so far, seem to have a significant impact on addiction and substance use disorder. Because if psychedelics can make you feel more connected to yourself, to others, to nature, to spirit, they can fill a void that might otherwise be filled with the substances that people develop substance use disorders around. So that helps explain a little bit about why psychedelics seem to be a non-selective treatment or non-specific treatment for substance use disorders. And science seems to be catching up to that now. We also asked individuals, of course, on therapeutic uses of psychedelics. We asked, have you ever used psychedelics to treat a physical or mental health symptom or condition? And 10% cited they'd used it for a physical health condition, and 47.7% for a mental health condition. And so just over half of respondents use psychedelics for a health condition of some kind or another. When it comes to mental health, the majority of participants using psychedelics cite depression, anxiety, and PTSD as the primary reasons for use. The good news is that's where most of the clinical research on psychedelics and mental health is being conducted right now. It's looking at depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Participants who use psychedelics for mental health rank it as a median 80 out of 100 in terms of efficacy, which is a really remarkable ranking of efficacy for basically treatments that are currently not approved yet anywhere in the world. And 63.5% cite that they discontinued the use of traditional mental health treatments, be they talk therapy or pharmacological treatments, following their use of psychedelics as a treatment for mental health. In terms of physical health conditions, the most common reasons for use were chronic pain, headaches and migraines, and sleeping disorders. And participants who use psychedelics for physical health rank it a median of 75 out of 100, so slightly lower than the 80 out of 100 for mental health, but still very impressive in terms of a non-approved treatment for chronic physical health conditions. However, because of the current legal status of psychedelics, just over 12% of respondents that have used psychedelics therapeutically benefited from the guidance of the healthcare professional. So that means that over that means that 88% use these for therapeutic purposes, use these substances for therapeutic purposes without the benefit of guidance or oversight of a healthcare practitioner. However, over 86% would use with the support of a healthcare practitioner if that was a legal option. And of those that did use it with a healthcare practitioner, over 95% assign at least some importance to the success of the experience. The good news is that through Canada's Special Access Program, through clinical trials taking place in Canada, the US, and around the world right now, and through ketamine and psychedelic clinics that are opening up in the US, Canada, and around the world, it is becoming slowly but surely easier to have legal, supervised experiences, therapeutic experiences with psychedelics. Although it's fair to say that most patients who could benefit from these treatments are still not accessing them in a legal setting. And now to go through the qualitative feedback that we received, we had a textual response option at the end of the survey that said, is there anything else you'd like to share with us? And after a 650 question survey, we frankly didn't expect there to be a lot of respondents who wanted to spend more time with us and share any more information with us. But we were surprised and pleased to find that 325 individuals added some comments at the end, 57% of which expressed positive opinions of psychedelic use. 38% didn't express clear positive or negative perceptions, and about 5% of responses indicated negative experiences or perceptions of psychedelic use. In terms of challenging experiences or bad trips, here are some quotes that were shared with us. One respondent said, I used mushrooms 3 times in high school and university. The last trip was awful, and I haven't touched them again in 25 years. The second time I used psilocybin mushrooms, I had an extremely unpleasant trip and went to the emergency room. This was the wrong decision, and I was treated terribly there. Addiction to psychedelics. So although psychedelics are not typically considered to be addictive, of course, people can develop patterns of use that are problematic and not beneficial. And so this individual said, when I first used LSD, I was 17 and found it very addictive. I was heavily addicted to psychedelics and increased use of them helped me to stop using them. The more I use substances, the less of a desire I feel to use them eventually. So that's an interesting treatment response. And then there are other respondents who said that they didn't get the desired effects. In this case, the respondent said, I haven't been able to do mushrooms since I started taking Wellbutrin. They don't work. In terms of positive feedback, we found that respondents cited that psychedelics help with healing, with forming meaningful connections with others, facilitating creativity, spirituality, coping or healing from problematic use of non-psychedelic drugs, and even suicide and suicidal ideation, and helping individuals to address loss and grief. Those were the key themes that came out of the comments left. Here's a few quotes that struck me. As a first responder, psychedelics have helped me cope and overcome the trauma I have experienced in my career. These substances have helped me gain insight into my own psyche, as well as my place in the wider universe. They have improved my life in ways I never thought possible, and I would love to see them become more accessible to emergency workers and, with great care and instruction, the general public. So a very thoughtful, well-written comment and about the positive impact of psychedelics on this individual's life. LSD awakened a sense of peace in me that goes beyond my ability to describe. It made me feel like coming home to myself. I like to use it once every couple of years to enter that sacred space and check in with myself. Psychedelics have helped me discontinue daily psychiatric medications for bipolar 2 that I was on for over a decade. Now I use occasional psychedelic experiences with careful preparation and integration when my mood destabilizes and/or microdosing, and it's very effective. These medicines and underground therapy has saved my life and been so transformative, so I'm extremely grateful. And finally, my use of psychedelics has been one of the most significant practices in my life. So the key findings of CPS 2022, just to review what we just covered, respondents were largely female in a committed relationship, well-educated and employed. Fun, spiritual exploration, and improved mental well-being are the primary reasons for psychedelic use, although reasons vary between substances. Access is typically via friends and online unregulated vendors. Patterns of use and co-use differ significantly between substances. Many participants report reductions in other substance use as a result of psychedelic use, and comparatively few report increases in use. Even intense negative experiences often had positive outcomes. And over half of respondents cite therapeutic use, mostly for psychological health, i.e. depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And most use for physical health was to treat chronic pain and sleep disorders. The majority of respondents didn't use under the guidance of a healthcare professional, but those that did found it to be an important contributor to success, and most would if it was a legally available option. Our next steps are to write up and publish the CPS findings, and I share these with policymakers, patients and physicians, and private insurers and the general public. I'm happy to share that so far we have 3 publications that are currently in press based on the CPS findings, and we're working on 4 or 5 more publications. And as mentioned at the start of this presentation, we're also looking forward to launching the Global Psychedelic Survey to create comparative data on psychedelic use in different international settings and jurisdictions. And that study will launch in April and May 2023. And I hope that some of you will have a chance or will have had a chance, if you're watching after the fact, to have filled out that survey. My sincere gratitude ultimately to my academic collaborators, Peter Hendricks, David Yaden, Kevin Banke, Eric Barron, Stephanie Lake and Ziva Cooper, Beth Patterson, Michael Van Amering, and Kyle Greenway, Sarah Daniels, to Savvy Minds, SciGen, and MAPS PBC, and to study participants for sharing their experiences via this very, very, very long survey. And all of you for your time, interest, and attention. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to take questions today because this is a recorded video. But I really want to thank you all so much for your time and for taking part in this course. And of course, I want to thank Atma for giving me the opportunity to present this data and be part of the curriculum of their training course. Should you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact me at Philippe@savvymind.com. That's Philippe, Philippe, at SavvyMind, SIBIMIND.com. And I wish you the best of luck with the rest of this course and of course with your ongoing work with psychedelics. Thank you very much.